To start today with the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Lamed Beis Amid Beis. Ha'over lifnei hatevot l'shliach tzibur b'yontiv Rishon b'yontiv shel Rosh Hashana, and then we have Shachris and we have Musaf Hasheni, which means the shots for Musaf. Maskia, he blows the shofar. B'shas ha'halel. In other Moadim, as we'll soon see, we don't recite Hallel on Rosh Hashana. Harishon, it's the first Shliach Tzibur. For Shachris, Makre es HaHallel. He is going to recite the Hallel. And it means that the Tzibur will be Ona Ach. Apparently, the minig was originally that the Shliach Tzibur would say the entire Hallel paragraph by paragraph, and at the end of each paragraph, or during the reading of the paragraph, the Tzibur would read along with it. Another possibility is that the word Ona here in the commentaries means that they would answer or respond to Odul Hashem Ki Tov or Ona Hashem Oshiana. So the Gemara asks the following question: Maishna, why is it that Sheni Maskia, that we delay the blowing of the shofar until Musaf, and we do not blow the shofar Shachris? And the Gemara thinks it's only one possible answer, invoking a pasuk in Mishlei, which establishes a principle that applies throughout Hilchos Tefillah, Mishum de Berov Am Hadras Melech. And apparently the younger people would come a little bit late sometimes. The shul would pack in, would fill up around Musaf time. And that's Berov Am on the highest level. So therefore they would postpone shofar blowing until Musaf, when the pews in the synagogue were filled. If that be the case, why is it that on Hallel we insist on Zrizim Makdimim Mitzvahs and we recite Hallel and Shachris, we don't wait till Musaf? What happened to Mishum Berov Am Hadras Melech? We should apply consistently the same principle. Ella Maishna Hal de Barishon. The reason why we would like to recite Hallel and Shachris as early as possible is we have a principle Zrizim Makdimim Mitzvahs is Tkiya Nami Nabed Barishon. Why not blow the shofar during Shachris? Mishum de Zrizim Makdimim Mitzvahs. Rabbi Yochanan b'Shas Zeres HaMalchus Shana. Our Mishnah reflects a time period in which the enemies of Jewish people prohibited the blowing of shofar, and they used to watch and send spies to oversee, to wait for the first 6 hours of the day during Shachris to see if the Jews were violating this decree and blowing shofar. And then they packed out. So the Jews were able to blow shofar at Musaf time without endangering their lives. Gemara's medayik in the Lashon HaMishnah, Midika Omar B'Shas Hallel, and in other moedos they recite Hallel, and the Shliach Tzibur will lead the Hallel. Bichlal, we could see, and derive the conclusion that Rosh Hashanah like a Hallel, my time, why don't we recite Hallel on Rosh Hashanah? Basically, any day that's endowed with a separate Kedusha Sayom and has a status of a Yontif should generate a chiyuv of Hallel. So why don't we omit Hallel on Rosh Hashanah, which is implicit in our Mishnah? Rabbi Avo, a very famous statement, Omru Malachi Ashar Sifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribbono Shel Olam, Mipnei Ma Ein Yisrael Omrim Shira Lefanecha, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Amalehem, God responds, Efshar, Melech Yoshev Al Kisei Din, the Sifrei Chaim and Sifrei Mesim, Tzuchim Lefanav, Yisrael Omrim Shira. Shira has to be recited out of a spirit of happiness and joy. But in the solemnity of the high holidays, when the books of life and death are open in front of the heavenly courts, the Jewish people are not in a happy mood And we need, as a precondition for Hallel, Simcha, which we don't have. Now, let's just raise a few quick questions before we go on. First of all, we blow shofar today right before Musaf. And l'chora, we would say that the gzera that we're not allowed to blow shofar in the morning is betela, and therefore, why not go back to what the original halacha would have been, zrizim akdila mitzvahs, like we saw in Hallel, and blow the shofar early. And Tosas is bothered by this, and he invokes a principle of Shema Yachzir Hadavar L'Kadmusa, that we never know whether or not history might repeat itself or get back to the original state. Another question that we wanted to raise here is, what does it mean, Sifrei Chaim, the Sifrei Mason? The Gemara, back on Daf Tez Zayin Beis, says that Shlosha Sfarim Niftachim Rosh Hashana, Echad Shel Rishonim, Echad Shel Tzadikim, Echad Shel Beinanim. So here we have in our Mishnah 2 Sfarim that are open and not 3. So the Maharsha answers, based on the Gemara Masechet Erechin, that on Rosh Hashana, the Beinanim are included under Sifrei Chaim. And the reason for that is because we assume that if there's no way of tipping the scale, Chas v'shalom l'misa, then they will be written in Sifrei Chaim. The truth is they'll be judged separately as Beinanim, but nevertheless, in terms of life or death, status quo, they're going to be included in the book of life. And just to summarize, as far as Hallel on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we omit Hallel because these are days of solemnity. And I'd like to quote to you the language of the Rabbi in Pirush HaMishnayos. He writes, Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim hem yemei avoda v'hachnoah, achad u'mora, v'yireim mimenu, u'mivrach u'manos elach, u'tshuva v'tachanunim, u'bakoshas kapara v'slicha, b'chol elu anyonim eno hogun haschok v'asim. The Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, Shofar Shel Rosh Hashanah ein mavirin olav es hatchum. If we have to go out of the tchum of Shabbos, which is 2,000 amma beyond the outer boundary of the city, in order to get access to a shofar or to hear the shofar, we are not allowed to violate the Isur Tchumin, even for the great mitzvah of shofar. Let's say a pile of stones had collapsed and the shofar is on the bottom of this pile of stones. We're not allowed to clear away the stones, even if it means that we won't fulfill the mitzvah of shofar. And the reason for that is because stones are muktzah, and we're not allowed to violate muktzah for the sake of the shofar. Now, the shofar itself, by the way, should be muktzah, but it's not because of the mitzvah. However, the avonim, the stones, they don't have a status of a chefetz shel mitzvah, and therefore to remove the stones, even to get access to the shofar, would be a violation of the Isur of muktzah. Furthermore, if the shofar is on top of a tree, la'olim be'ilan, on Rosh Hashanah, we're not permitted to climb the tree to get access to the shofar, because on both Shabbos and Yom Tov, there's what's called an Isur Shvus Midivreim. The Rabbanan did not allow climbing a tree. We're afraid that he might pluck some leaves or fruits off the branches of the tree and violate the malacha of Ktsira. And if the shofar would only be accessible if we violate this Shvus by climbing up a tree, then we will not blow shofar. Below Rofen al Gabi Behema, the Rabbanan prohibited riding animals on Shabbos and Yom Tov, Shema Yachtov Anaf Kidei Kosa, and then he would violate Ktsira, and we will not allow you to drive on an animal on Rosh Hashanah, even if that's the only way you'll get access to the shofar. Below Shatim Al Pnei Hamayim, if you would have to swim across the river in order to get access to a shofar, then we're not going to permit you to do so. So, David, you just joined us. We're finishing up yesterday's daf. We didn't get a chance yet, so we haven't even started the daf yet. In any event, what's the problem with swimming on Shabbos and Yom Tov? This is a gzeira that the Chachamim instituted. Shema yavo lahaskin b'Shabbos chavis shal shaitin. He might violate Meleches Makabar Patish by creating some sort of raft in order to get across the river. So even if he will have no ability to fulfill the mitzvah shofar on Rosh Hashana, because he would have to take a swim across the river to get access to the shofar, to hear the shofar, we will not permit him to do so, even for the sake of the great mitzvah of shofar. The poskim point out, and I point this out as an interesting aside point, that you're allowed to tell a guy to bring the shofar michutz l'tchum, because Amir Akum is only a shvus derabanan, and chutz l'tchum is also only a shvus derabanan, and now we pile up shvus the shvus, which we'll matir for the sake of the mitzvah of shofar. That's called shvus the shvus b'makom mitzvah. The Mishnah continues, V'ein chotlin oso bein b'davar shu mishum shvus ubein b'davar shehu mishum losas. If, let's say, you have to cut the shofar, and here we have machlokes mefarshim, either it means to cut the shofar off the head of the animal, it's still attached to the head, or it means that you have to make a hole in the shofar, because otherwise the air won't blow through the shofar. So you've already cut the shofar before Rosh Hashana, but you didn't drill the hole into the shofar. All this is prohibited on Rosh Hashana, even though it means he will forfeit the mitzvah shofar. And when the Mishnah says, Bein b'davar she'isur mishum lo taseh isur mishum shvus, the Gemara is going to explain. Aval im ratzo litem litocho mayim o yayin. They used to soak the shofar in water or wine, and that would somehow make the kol, the sound of the shofar, be more clear. It's called salul. You think that you're allowed to do even on Rosh Hashana. That's not considered a violation of Makabar Patish of Tikkun Kli. And here the Tzfas Emes points out that it all depends. If there's no kol shofar, unless you soak it, that would be Tikkun Kli, and that would be prohibited. But if there is a kol shofar, just you want to improve the kol shofar, then by soaking it in wine or water, that's not considered Tikkun Kli, because it is functional even without soaking it. The Gemara is actually going to address a question of soaking it in urine. Apparently, even urine has a certain acidy thing that could help the shofar, but that we're not going to do because that's a bizui to the mitzvah of shofar. Ein ma'akvenes hatinokos militkoa. A mature adult is not allowed to blow shofar on Rosh Hashana if he's already fulfilled his mitzvah, because as we said before, shofar is a clay umnus. It's a kind of a chachma, which is prohibited min rabbanon on Yom Tov. We only do it for the sake of the mitzvah. In the case of a tinok, which are yiladim ktanim, they're young children, then we want to be mechanich them in the mitzvah of shofar, and therefore we're going to permit the children to blow the shofar and violate what would be for us, for adults, an isid rabbanon. And although the mitzvah of chinuch should apply even for shofar, to prohibit them from violating the isid rabbanon blowing shofar, but when the rabbanon instituted the isur, or I should say the chiyuv of chinuch, they did it in a way that if there's a collision between chinuch for a mitzvah and an isur rabbanon, then they're not going to be mechanich them for the isur rabbanon, but rather they would choose to be mechanich them for the mitzvah. So even though blowing the shofar per se for someone who's not obligated in the shofar would be a violation of an isur rabbanon, the rabbanon never instituted that isur for the katan to obligate the katan to observe that Isur and enjoin himself from violating that Isur because of chinuch, but rather the Rabbanan opted in favor of chinuch for the mitzvah of shofar. And aval misaskim imoyim. The Gemara is going to go into great detail as to whether or not this means that b'di'evid you're allowed to, or is it mutar even l'chatchila to train the children to blow the shofar to sheyilmedu, so they'll learn and be mechanech them in the mitzvah of shofar. And finally, the Mishnah concludes with a new din of misasek. It means a person had no kavanah whatsoever to bring out the kolos of the shofar. Let's say he wanted to clean out the shofar, he was blowing into it and a kol shofar came out, lo yotza, that's called misasek. Misasek means when you had no kavanah for the maisa at all. And the Mishnah adds, and since the misasek is not creating a kol shofar, even though physically it is a kol shofar, therefore the shomea cannot fulfill his mitzvah. He's not hearing a bona fide kol shofar. Gemara asks, my timer, why is it that the mitzvah of shofar does not override all those different prohibitions that we mentioned? We have a principle in Shas that esei docha losa, which we derive from kilayim b'tzitzis. And if you could be docha lotzas doraisa, how much more so you should be able to be docha and isa d'Rabbanan. And the Gemara answers shofar asehu. The mitzvah of shofar is a mitzvah aseh yom trua yelachem. The yontif esei velosas. In Parshas Emor, the Torah commands us to observe the yontif with both a mitzvah losaseh and as well a mitzvah aseh. The Torah says, "Kol melechas avoda losasu," that's a losaseh. And then further it says, Yelachem Shabboson, which is a mitzvah aseh. And the principle is, Ein aseh docha losa sevi aseh. If you have on one side of the scale an eseh, and on the other side of the scale you have a losa aseh and an eseh, like in the case of Yontif, which is both a losa and an eseh, then the eseh cannot trump the losa sevi eseh of Yontif. The eseh here of Shofar cannot override Yontif. And again, even though we're not talking about an overriding of Yontif on a Doraisa level, we're talking about Isur D'Rabbanan, like going Chutzit Chum, or for example, taking the Avonim out in order to get access to the Shofar, which is a violation of Isur Muktzah. But nevertheless, we have a principle called Chachamim Osu Chizuk L'Divreim Yoser Mishal Torah. So if a mitzvah of Yontif, which is both an essay and a lot, that does not lend itself to Dechiyah, then the Rabbanan are going to make that chizuk, even if it means that we're talking about violating an Isur Yontif mid-Rabbanan, because the Rabbanan give chizuk, they upgrade the status of the Isur D'Rabbanan, and therefore there's no essay dophalosis. Now on this Gemara that we just learned, there's a tremendous amount of iyun that would normally be required, but not in the framework of the Daf Yomi, and that is, how does the Gemara apply essay dophalosis? Essay dochalosa only applies if at the moment that you fulfill the essay, you violate the losas. But if, let's say, you'll violate the losas as a preliminary action, and then subsequently you'll be makai of the mitzvah, then it's too late to apply essay dochalosas. And if the essay and the losas are not simultaneous, if they're not in sync, there's no essay dochalosas. And here, all the violations that are mentioned in the Mishnah are in order to obtain the shofar. He hasn't yet fulfilled the mitzvah. He's only at the stage of preliminary hechsher. And technically, this should not be essay dochalosas. That's going to be a sugya in the Rishonim and the Achronim, that ein ha'isur nases b'shas kiyum mitzvah. It's only l'tzorech hechsher, b'achanas mitzvah. That's when he violates the isur. The Mishnah says, "Lo olim be'ilan v'lo rochvin al gavi behema b'Rosh Hashana in order to yikai the mitzvah of shofar, because these are all prohibited." So the Gemara asks, "Hashta the Amrit lo." Now that you've told me in the Mishnah that we will not violate these isurim of, let's say, for example, chutz l'tchum or ola be'ilan, rechiv al gabi behema, is the oraisa mipoile? Did you have to tell me that we don't violate an? Okay, now here it gets a little tricky. I'm just going to explain it according to Rashi. And that is when the Gemara says the oraisa mipoile, it's referring to aliyah al gabi ilon, rechiva al gabi behema. These two cases are derabbanans, isurim derabanan, michashash yovo al yodam leisu doraisa. When the Gemara says doraisa, it's classifying these derabbanans. So for example, we could divide up the Mishnah into the following two categories. There's tchum, pinui avonim, which means violating tchum or muktzah. That's on one category. That has nothing to do with an Issa Torah. And on the other side, we have Aliyah Le'ilan and Rechiv al Gab Behema, where the Xeris Chachamim was atu a cheshatz that maybe you'll come to violate the Isser of Ktsira, as we discussed before. And the Gemara says, once you've already told me that we don't violate Tchumin or Pinui Gal Avanim for the sake of Shofar, then how much more so I know by myself, it's understood with the Kal V'chomer that I would not violate the Isser of Aliyah Be'ilan or Rechiv al Gabi Behema, which are Xeris Machshash Doraisa. So why did the Mishnah go ahead and write all these cases? And the Gemara answers, we have a principle in the methodology, in the literary style of the Mishnah, Eino Zo v'ein tzarich lomer zo ktani, that sometimes the Mishnah will tell you this case, and it goes without saying this case. And that's a pedagogical style of the Mishnah. Now the Gemara asks the following, V'ein chodchin oso. The Mishnah tells me that we not cut the shofar in order to make it appropriate for the mitzvah. And here we're starting today's daf, which is daf Lamed Gimel.